Let's get started on Module 2, Introduction to Virtualization, Part 2. We're going to talk about Lesson 2, vSphere User Interfaces, and Lesson 3, an overview of ESXi. A large part of your job is to configure ESXi hosts, and there are different methods of configuring ESXi hosts. You can use a direct console user interface, you can use the vSphere client, the vSphere web client, or the command line interface. These are all different methods of configuring the ESXi host. But let's all make sure we're clear on what an ESXi host is. An ESXi host is a big computer with a large number of processors and a lot of RAM, and multiple virtual machines run on the ESXi host. And our job as network engineers is the configuration of the ESXi host. A smaller data center might have 1 or 2 or 3 ESXi hosts, but a large data center might have many ESXi hosts. And what our job is to configure those ESXi hosts. And you can configure an ESXi host locally or remotely. Most configuration will be done remotely. However, certain initial configurations, such as the installation and the assigning of an IP address, is done locally. So let's look at local host configuration. Now, when I say local, I mean you walk up to the ESXi host, and when you are logging on locally, they call that the direct console user interface. So let's look at the direct console user interface. This is what the screen looks like on an ESXi host, and it's not terribly exciting. To configure the ESXi host, you would press F2, then you'll type in the administrator name, which is root, and the password which you assigned upon installation, and you click on OK. Then we click on Configure Network Management, and then we click on IP Configuration. And this is where we assign an IP address, a subnet mask, and a default gateway to this ESXi host. And this is TCP/IP configuration, just as we would do on a Windows server. We give the computer an IP address, a subnet mask, and a default gateway. So I will assign those variables of IP address, subnet mask, and default gateway, standard TCP/IP configuration variables. Click on OK. Click on Escape, and let's just for a second look at view support information. And this shows the secure socket layer secure hash algorithm key, which is used for encryption and identification of clients to that ESXi host, and we will look at that more later. So let me escape out of here, and that's it. That's really all we're going to configure on the ESXi host. Escape out of here, and this is called configuring the ESXi host locally. But typically, you would be configuring the ESXi host remotely from your workstation. And to do that, you would have to install the vSphere client software on your workstation so you could remotely connect to and configure the ESXi host. The vSphere client is the software that you install on your workstation to remotely connect to ESXi host to configure them. Or to put it another way, you typically don't walk up to an ESXi host to configure it. To configure it, you connect from your workstations. And then when you connect, you would create virtual machines and install operating systems, etc. So let's connect to the ESXi host using the vSphere client. In Chapter 14, we will look at how to install the vSphere client. And after it is installed, we will see there's a shortcut on the desktop that says vSphere client. I will click on the vSphere client, and type in the IP address of the ESXi host that I want to connect to, type in the administrator name, which is root, and type in the password. I click on login, and now I am connected to the ESXi host. Typically, we would click on inventory, and when I click on inventory, it takes me to the Getting Started tab. What is a host? A host is a computer that uses virtualization software such as ESXi to run virtual machines. Hosts provide the CPU and memory resources that virtual machines use. Click on Summary. The Summary tab shows the manufacturer of this ESXi host. It's a Hewlett-Packard. It shows it has Xeon processors, 32 gig of RAM. It's connected to a data store. Right now it's not working very hard. If we click on the Virtual Machines tab, we see that there are only 3 virtual machines on this ESXi host, and only one of them is running. If we look at allocation of resources, we can see how much RAM and CPU utilization each virtual machine is being allocated. If we click on the Performance tab, we can see how hard this ESXi host is working, and it's not working hard at all because we only have one virtual machine running on it. But we will see in a subsequent chapter, we will look in greater detail and see how this tells us when the ESXi host is overloaded. If we click on the Configuration tab, we can see that the health status is okay. Click on Processors. It shows we have Xeon processors. If I click on Memory, it shows that we have 32 gig of RAM, so this would be considered a small ESXi host. If I click on Local Users and Groups, you can see how these are the people who can log on, who can connect to this ESXi host, and we will see in a subsequent chapter how you can add yourself. If we click on Events, it shows all of the events, all of the error messages that have occurred on this ESXi host recently, and we will look at that in a later chapter. If we click on Permissions, we see who has the power to create and delete virtual machines on this ESXi host, and we will cover that more later. Let's turn our attention back to the Configuration tab. And in the Configuration tab, I would like to look at some of the things that you would typically initially configure after installing the ESXi host, bringing it up, and then connecting it to it with the vSphere client. Now, we already assigned it an IP address when we were physically connected. But now we're remotely connected, we're going to configure the following variables: license, time and date, host name, and DNS suffix. We click on the Configuration tab for this ESXi host, and under the license features, we click on Edit, and we can see that this is currently installed in evaluation mode. So what you can do is you can download, anybody can download a free copy of the ESXi software, the vSphere software, and install it on your system, and it'll work just fine for 60 days because it's in evaluation mode. And then if you really like it, then what you do is you go back and you connect to VMware, and then you buy the license key. So anybody can download the software, as I expect you will do as students, and it runs a fully blown version of the operating system for 60 days. And then you buy the license key, and you enter the license key. And in this example, I will enter the license key followed by OK. Another variable we can configure is the time and the date. If we select Properties for time and date, we can specify the time, we can specify the date, and we can click on the checkbox that says Network Time Protocol Enabled. And what that means is that it will sync up with a time server, such as the server at the National Institute of Standards. Click on OK. And then this is more TCP/IP configuration right here under DNS and routing. If I click on Properties, we can see the default host name is simply localhost, and it has no DNS suffix. So we will give it a a host name. In this case, I'll just call it ESXi6 because I have 5 other ESXi hosts, and this is the 6th one. And then I specify the domain name. Since we're the Community College of Baltimore County, we will use a domain name of, in this example, CCBC. And then we specify the IP address of the DNS server, which, as you know, is used for host name resolution. And then under the Routing tab, we specify the IP address of the default gateway. Click on OK, and these are standard TCP/IP configuration variables. Authentication we will cover later. So vSphere Client is a software that you install on your workstation so you can remotely connect to and configure ESXi hosts, and that's what you will be using mostly in this class and in your career when you configure ESXi hosts. Now let's look at the vSphere web client. If you are not at work and you're at Starbucks, you surf the internet, you get a text message that says there's a problem with a server at work. We need you to bring up a virtual machine or migrate a virtual machine. So what you can do is you can use the vSphere web client to connect to the ESXi host over the internet, even if you're hanging out at a Starbucks. Let's look at the ESXi, the vSphere web client. If we look at the vSphere web client, I type in the administrator name and the password, followed by login. And there is our vCenter server, and I can click on vCenter Home. And if I click on our vCenter server, I can see there is our data center, and in that data center there are multiple ESXi hosts. And if I want to look at the virtual machines running on one particular ESXi host, I click on virtual machines, and this shows that multiple virtual machines are on this ESXi host. And if I need to turn one of those virtual machines on, I click under Action and Power on Virtual Machine, or I could migrate a virtual machine, clone a virtual machine, all of which we'll cover later in the class, or I could create a new virtual machine. vSphere Web Client allows us to connect to and configure ESXi hosts over the internet. Installation is covered in Module 14. The graphical user interface is easier. You just point and click. But as we get to more advanced levels of computing, we find ourselves using the command line more and more. VMware has the vSphere command line interface. And we will see that there are 3 command line interface products: the vSphere command line interface, the vSphere management assistant, and the PowerShell, Power Command Line interface. So let's look at those. If we go to www.vmware.com, we see that the vSphere Command Line interface, VCLA, command allows you to run common system administration commands against an ESXi system from any machine which has network access. So the vSphere command line interface is an application which we install on a Windows server or a Linux server. It contains a set of command line tools that can be used to execute remotely on the ESXi host. And then the next one is the vSphere Management Assistant, VMA, allows administrators and developers to run scripts and agents to manage ESXi hosts. The vSphere Management Assistant is a virtual appliance which is installed on a host. And we will talk more about what virtual appliances are later, but the short answer is a virtual appliance is a piece of pre-configured software. And it is a platform for various developer toolkits, such as the Software Developer Toolkit for Perl, or the vSphere application programming interface. And then the third method, if you know Windows, they have something called PowerShell, which is their high-end command line interface. So the VMware PowerCLA is used to automate tasks and to perform scripting using PowerShell. And when you install it, what you're doing is you are adding additional commands to Windows PowerShell, commands specific to virtualization. 3 methods of managing the ESXi host from the command prompt. We really don't get into them in this class. We stay primarily with the vSphere client command line interface. So a large part of your job as a virtual network infrastructure engineer is to manage and configure the ESXi host, to create virtual machines, to migrate virtual machines. And there are 4 general methods of connecting to the ESXi host. One, you go up to the ESXi host using direct command line user interface. Don't do that one much. You use the vSphere client, which is used to manage the ESXi host using a graphical user interface. The vSphere web client you can use from any internet connection, such as Starbucks. And for more advanced features, such as scripting, you can use the command prompt. Most of us will be using the vSphere client for most of our careers, configuring ESXi host, and that's what we use mostly in this course. Let's now discuss the different vSphere editions: vSphere Standard, vSphere Enterprise, and Enterprise Plus. 3 different editions. If we go to www.vmware.com and we compare the vSphere editions, we see Standard, Enterprise, and Enterprise Plus. And if we look at the basic features, vMotion, creating virtual machines, etc., there's not really a difference between Standard, Enterprise, and Enterprise Plus. But if you scroll down, you will see that some of the more advanced features, such as DRS, the Distributed Resource Scheduler, which we will use later on to perform load balancing, are only supported by Enterprise and Enterprise Plus. And then even more advanced features, such as distributive switches, which we don't cover in this class. We just talk about standard switches, are only included in Enterprise Plus. And then they have these vSphere Essential Kits. vSphere Essential Kits are for small businesses and combine virtualization for up to 3 physical servers. So this is for small organizations. Essentials Kit just has the vSphere Hypervisor, and the Essentials Kit Plus has the hypervisor as well as high availability and vMotion, which we will discuss later on in this course. And to give you an idea for the kind of prices, we can see that a starting price for the Essentials Kit is $500. And then at the higher end, we've got $5,000. And here at the Community College of Baltimore County, we have spent more than $50,000 in vSphere licenses because we have 3 data centers and we have a lot of ESXi hosts. Now, you can download the thing for free. In fact, anybody can download it for free. In fact, they want you to download it for free and to install it and to like it, and then to come back and buy the license key from them and install the license key. And later on in Chapter 14, I will show you how you can download that. So in summary, Module 2, we looked at what is virtualization and why use virtualization. We looked at the components of a virtual network infrastructure, which include vSphere, ESXi hosts, virtual machines, storage area networks, virtual disks and VMF data stores, and virtual switches. And then we looked at different methods of configuring the ESXi host, particularly using the vSphere client command line interface. And then lastly, we looked at the different editions of vSphere. And this concludes part 2 of Module 2, Introduction to Virtualization. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.